It's been 15 years since Mirror's Edge first released, and I think for a 15-year-old game, it holds up incredibly well. I remember the first time I saw the game, I was instantly hooked. It has a bright color scheme, catchy electronic music, and fast gameplay. There hadn't been a game up to that point that had that kind of mix. Tons of other great games were released in 2008, but Mirror's Edge stuck out as a game that was different. Made by DICE and published by EA, it's a first-person game that didn't focus on combat, but instead focused entirely on movement mechanics. It's left a massive impact on the gaming industry, with many games following in its footsteps and adding their own twist and spin on first-person parkour mechanics. That being said, I don't think any game has come close to being as ambitious with its movement. Mirror's Edge only uses about 4 buttons for movement, but allows you to do all sorts of unique moves by pressing them in various combinations. The left bumper lets you jump, the left trigger lets you crouch, the right bumper lets you do a quick 180 turn, and the right trigger lets you punch. And with all of that combined, you can climb to heights that you could only dream of in other games. I remember the first time I played the game's tutorial, I found it incredibly difficult to wrap my head around various movement mechanics. It felt like it took me ages to figure out how to do a wall run quick turn. And it's literally just pressing 3 buttons. My first playthrough felt more like a puzzle game than a first-person platformer. But as I got more comfortable with the controls, I started noticing different shortcuts and different lines and different paths that I could take. It became incredibly addicting to replay levels and see them in a new light. Speaking of the levels in the game's level design is top-notch, to the point that it feels like it's your rival. Sure, there's enemy AI to avoid, but the majority of your interaction and feedback comes from the environment itself. Every time you think you've bested, you discover new ways that you could play better. Even today, a whole 15 years later, I'm still finding new shortcuts that I hadn't found previously. I really appreciated the pacing and the level design as well. So throughout the levels, you get to bounce kind of back and forth between these puzzles and chases. It feels extremely dynamic, and it is a great way to play with the movement mechanics. While the layout of the levels is top-notch, the visuals are really stunning as well. I mean, take a look at some of these levels. They all have a very distinct look and feel, and no two levels feel the same. The colors, lighting, and environment all look different. And this is something I've really come to appreciate over the years, as far too often game levels start to feel quite repetitive. In addition to the unique appearance of all the levels, each level has a unique song to accompany it, and not only that, but they have a puzzle portion of the track along with a chase portion. It was super interesting to hear the audio shift as you progress through a level. The soundtrack was made by Solar Fields, and I think the music meshes with the game so well that it becomes an integral part of the experience. Kind of like how Minecraft wouldn't be Minecraft without C418. So, while creating this video, I did some further digging online and found that the game's architecture has a blend of Eastern and Western influence, which I thought was actually pretty interesting as I hadn't really considered where they got their inspiration for the world design from. One section in the game has you being hunted in a massive sewer system, which some of you might recognize took inspiration from the giant sewer system that sits underneath Tokyo. And as you play the game, you'll maybe notice a variety of languages on signs and advertising. So I had always assumed it was some kind of cultural melting pot of a city. That being said, I didn't realize how many different languages they actually packed into the game. I found an interesting Reddit post from 8 years ago outlining some of the various languages featured in the game. One thing you've likely noticed from all of this footage is the great use of color in this game. During my first playthrough of the game, I really admired that the colors pop, and the game had some interesting textures and lighting work. Sometimes while playing, I would just stop and look around for a bit and take it all in. The environments still sometimes surprise me with how good they look. After reading more about the game, it turns out this was a much more deliberate choice made by the developers, and its purpose was to help guide the player using what the game calls runner vision. As you approach various objects in the game, you'll see certain objects get highlighted in red. This allows the player to see key interaction points in the environment, but also act as a soft guide throughout the levels. Another thing you might have noticed from the footage here is that the game lacks a HUD. I wish more games would be able to pull this off. When it's done just right, it feels so much more immersive. One point of contention over the years has been whether the game should have had any kind of combat. I'm still not personally sure what the right solution should have been. However, I think that one of the main issues is that many new players would get stuck at key roadblocks that feature groups of enemies. The game doesn't baby you, so when enemies do appear, in most cases, you must succeed in your escape right away, otherwise you get caught at a point where you fight, or you die attempting to scramble away. Sometimes dying repeatedly, over and over. And I can understand why people would get frustrated by this. For those who were enjoying the movement mechanics, it would feel limiting when they felt like they had to stop and fight. Additionally, the guns were purposefully designed to be temporary tools. However, I'm not sure if this was communicated well to the players. The guns weren't designed to feel like you're the Master Chief mowing down Covenant aliens with ease. They're awkward, they spray a lot, and you're slowed down while you're using them. The developers clearly tried to indirectly nudge players away from using them. However, they also caused a bit of a pain point for players when they felt like they had no choice but to use them. One of the main things I really enjoyed about the game's sequel is that it allowed you to have fast takedown movements. I wish something like that could have been incorporated better into the first game. Something that allowed you to fight, but that didn't slow you down. However, I would imagine it's easier said than done. As we saw from the sequel, removing guns altogether and focusing on melee combat didn't fix the issue, and in some ways, ended up making it worse. My opinion of the gunplay and combat in Mirror's Edge changed significantly over the years. I still sometimes get stuck at those roadblock sections, and it feels like the wind kind of gets taken from your sails. You're flying through a level and then suddenly you get stopped. After I got better at the game, I found sometimes I could get past those sections without fighting. However, it does feel random at times. Sometimes I've played a section and I feel like I'm playing it identically to how I played it in the past, but sometimes I still end up dying to the enemies. And there's some sections where you're still pigeonholed into fighting certain enemies, and those sections still suck. They were obviously placed there to kind of mix up the gameplay, but I feel like they just didn't work out as well. I think if the developers figured out a way to keep players moving, or gave players a way to protect themselves against enemies in those situations, players probably would have had a better time overall with the game. Ultimately, not every player is going to connect with the game enough to want to replay it multiple times. So I imagine it was probably a difficult choice for the developers to make during the balancing of the game as well. Overall, I would just say play the game on easy. You don't really miss anything by playing on that difficulty level, and it helps ease up on some of those moments that could have been tweaked a little better. I still seem to get stuck at a few parts here and there, and it'll just save you a headache in the long run. While I think Mirror's Edge is a great game, I don't think it's perfect, so this might help you enjoy it a bit better. One thing I loved though about the game's enemies was the inclusion of pursuit cops. I thought that was just an excellent way to mix up the gameplay in the later levels. In the beginning of the game, the police and SWAT you encounter are slow. They don't really move around much, and for the most part, they don't have to. But in later levels of the game, you encounter police that are trained runners just like you. So, you go from dodging mainly stationary enemies to AI that will hunt you down. It's incredibly intense the first time you encounter them. I feel like describing it doesn't do it justice though, so check out this scene. Did you notice anything special about that chase? While you're running away in a panic to get away from these new enemies, you can hear their footsteps pounding behind you. It's an incredibly exhilarating detail. Like, holy hell, there are very few games that I can think of that deliver that level of pressure and excitement so quickly to a player. Mirror's Edge is one of the only titles where I felt compelled to jump back in and go find collectibles after I finished the game. I think the game's shorter runtime, along with the great visual appeal, helped immensely with this. Normally, I wouldn't bother with additional busy work in a game, but this gave me an excuse to go check out that environment that I thought looked so impressive. And at this point, after collecting everything I could find, I didn't really touch the game's other features for a while. I just replayed the game from time to time, but eventually, I wanted more. That's when I realized that the game's time trial system was super interesting. So, the time trials come in two flavors. You have the option to speedrun each story level, which I think was a super smart decision, and then you also have the option to play handcrafted time trial levels. All of the levels feature locations from the story, but have you exploring the various environments in ways that you wouldn't likely have when you were playing the story. The game did have a leaderboard, but the times on the board were quickly cheated. I didn't mind too much, as you could just guesstimate the rough actual spot you placed on the board, which was still fun for me. Recently, however, EA removed the leaderboards from both Mirror's Edge titles, which is a bit of a bummer. I think Catalyst relied heavier on the online features, as players could create custom races in that game's open world, whereas with the first game, you can still run time trials without an online connection. The game also had DLC time trials, and these DLC time trials were also extremely interesting. Instead of going with more cities and buildings to explore, you're in a world that looks like a simulation or a dreamscape. All of these time trials use bold colors and various shapes to create interesting environments to run through. I really enjoyed the minimalist feel of these levels, and if you looked out into the distance, you were just over open ocean high up in the air. I thought it was just a cool, surreal setting. I love tackling these time trials repeatedly, and I'm still beating some of my times now, which is super satisfying. I've never really been a person to stick to a single game for super long periods of time, but Mirror's Edge is a title I've been able to revisit again and again. Thanks to its shorter runtime, if you're good at the game, you can finish it in a few hours or less, which is honestly crazy to me. Seriously, go check out some of the speedruns of the game, they're insane. At the time of the game's release, it wasn't uncommon for a game's runtime to last around 6 to 10 hours. It was kind of annoying, especially as a kid with no income for new games. But now as an adult, I've come to appreciate shorter games that are all flavor and no filler. Being able to get right into a good game can be super satisfying, and I feel like Mirror's Edge is a perfect example of that. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. If you haven't played Mirror's Edge, I really recommend you give it a try. I think it's an incredible title that is still worth playing in 2024 and has truly earned its cult classic status. Take care and see you next time.